Hi, I'm Kate.
And I'm Phil.
And welcome to this very special edition of the Underground podcast. Today we're starting a two-part journey into one of the most critical and transformative topics facing the garden sector right now, the transition to peat-free compost. For decades, peat has been the backbone of growing media. It's loved for its reliability, consistency, and versatility. But as we've learned more about its environmental impact, the call to move away from peat has become impossible to ignore.
In this first episode, we're digging into the why. Why do we need to transition away from peat? Why is it such a valuable material? And why is it proving so difficult to replace? We'll also explore the environmental consequences of peat extraction, from biodiversity loss to carbon emissions. And we'll hear from leading voices in the industry about the challenges and opportunities that come from finding sustainable alternatives.
Then, in episode 2, we'll get practical, looking at the realities of making peat-free work. We'll dive into the challenges for professional growers, home gardeners and garden centres, while also uncovering the innovations driving the future of growing media.
Together, these episodes will give you a full picture of the peat-free transition, why it's so important, and how the garden sector is rising to the challenge.
So, grab a cup of tea, get comfortable, and join us as we uncover the roots of the peat-free revolution. Let's get started.
So before we get really stuck in, I thought it would be good to establish exactly what it is we're talking about, and who better to address our questions to than Elaine Gotts.
Elaine has been the research and development scientist at Levington for over 30 years. She's played a pivotal role in their journey from peat-based to peat-free growing media. Elaine has tested hundreds of alternative materials and overseen the transition of iconic brands like Miracle-Gro and Levington to peat-free formulations. Her insights into the technical and practical aspects of growing media are unmatched.
And with such an auspicious resume, who better to tell us the difference between compost and soil?
That's a really good question. And I think this is one of those situations where the English language has really confused us, and particularly confused consumers, because I guess you're asking me about growing media. You're not actually asking me the difference between compost and soil. You're asking me the difference between growing media and soil.
So is there a difference between compost and growing media?
Yes. So
Right.
compost is a verb and a noun. So to compost, you break down organic matter in the presence of air. So you compost in your compost heap in your garden. And what you make through that process is compost.
Okay.
What we make and put into bags is growing media. But people buy it as compost. And the difference between compost or growing media and soil is just sometimes described as soil in situ. So soil in your garden, in a field, where it's made in the ground, that's soil. So if you're planting in your beds and borders, you're planting into soil. If you're planting into a container, or maybe if you built a raised bed and you've filled it with something else, then you'll feel that you're growing into growing media.
Got you. What's so good about peat anyway? I think we need to understand why it became the gold standard in growing media and why replacing it is so challenging. First up is Simon Blackhurst. Simon has worked in the horticulture sector for years, including his time at Bord na Móna, which was Ireland's leading peat supplier. During his tenure, he focused on developing peat-free alternatives, helping to pioneer sustainable growing media solutions. Now, as a consultant, Simon helps manufacturers like Thurston's develop innovative, high-quality products for the peat-free future.
I think we have to sort of take it back to peat in terms of why we used peat or why we still do use peat in certain situations. it's stable. It doesn't really do anything. It's a blank canvas for a manufacturer to be able to apply whatever nutrients and surfactants, etc., that they need to be able to produce it for a specific plant type. And it's very easy if you start with a blank piece of paper to then add in what you need. So that's why peat was very helpful and easy to utilize.
Simon really captures why peat's consistency and versatility made it so attractive to growers and manufacturers alike. But it's not just about consistency. Peat was also a blank canvas, giving manufacturers unparalleled control over the growing media mix. Here's Elaine Gotts again from the Levington Research Station.
Thinking about how we were with peat, we were used to working with a material which was acidic and had no nutrients in it. So It was a blank canvas. And from a fertilizer company point of view, we could put as much lime in as we wanted to adjust the pH to the right point. We could put in as much fertilizer as we wanted to get to the right fertilizer level for the plants you're growing.
Peat's consistency was a game changer for growers, but as we've moved into peat-free, achieving similar performance is proving to be a challenge. Here's Simon again on how peat-free alternatives sometimes require a different approach.
Now, as we move into the peat-free world, we've got lots of different ingredients that have different chemical and physical properties all coming together and then having their own interactions whilst within the bag or, whilst they're stored. Yeah. And they're expecting, a similar result at the end, and it's not that straightforward.
One of the main challenges has been that, particularly from a consumer home gardener point of view, our customers have got used to gardening in peat over a relatively short space of time, really, because the first peat containing mixes weren't brought in until the late 60s. But people have got used to working with that medium. And it's absolutely possible to change, but people need to adapt the way that they grow as they adapt to new materials.
Peat's physical, chemical and biological properties clearly set it apart as a growing media. But as both Simon and Elaine's work has shown, the environmental cost of using peat makes it unsustainable. But what are the environmental consequences of peat extraction? From carbon emissions to biodiversity loss, we'll uncover why moving away from peat is no longer just a choice, it's a necessity.
To explore these questions, we'll be hearing from a diverse range of voices, each bringing a wealth of expertise and a unique perspective to the discussion. Let's start with Will Scott. Will is the team leader at Heart of Eden, a peat-free brand under AHS Limited. Will's scientific training and years in the horticultural industry have given him a deep understanding of sustainability and the challenges of developing peat-free products. His team has never used peat in their products, making them pioneers in sustainable growing media.
Well, and the statistic that I take home every day, which really has stuck with me, is peat regrows something like 1 millimetre a year.
Yeah.
So if you take a metre worth of peat out, that'll take 1,000 years to come back, if it come back at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
We just can't be doing that. It's not sustainable.
Will highlights the stark reality of peat's regeneration, or lack of it. That's a critical starting point, but the environmental impact of peat extraction goes even further. Next, we'll hear from Jane Hartley, the brand portfolio manager for growing categories at Evergreen Garden Care, with over 20 years' experience in the horticultural industry. Jane has been instrumental in driving Evergreen's sustainability initiatives, including their transition to peat-free growing media. Her passion for responsible sourcing and rigorous product testing ensures their products meet both performance and environmental standards.
Peat obviously doesn't score particularly well in that area because it takes 1,000 years to generate peatland, and within 50 minutes we've swiped it off the earth.
That's a powerful visual. The scale of biodiversity loss caused by peat extraction is staggering. Our next contributor, Steve Harper, brings another crucial perspective. Steve is the chair of the Responsible Sourcing Scheme and managing director of Southern Trident. With decades of experience in growing media production, Steve has been a leading advocate for measuring and improving the sustainability of all growing media substrates.
Obviously, we all knew what the issues with peat were in terms of carbon. It's not renewable, and when you're opening new peat bogs, you're destroying habitat and biodiversity. So it's got big issues.
And finally, we'll hear from Sally next. Sally is an environmental gardener, writer, and a leading advocate for sustainable horticulture. As part of the peat-free partnership, Sally has been at the forefront of lobbying for legislation to ban peat use in horticulture across the UK. Her expertise in low-carbon gardening and her deep connection to nature make her a compelling voice in this debate.
People are very committed to this idea of giving up peat in gardening. I think that they don't like the fact that there's peat in their compost. They don't like the fact that they're having to rip up peat bogs and ruin biodiversity, release all that carbon as well. Because we all know about carbon sequestration and its importance in fighting climate change these days. That message has very much got through. I think that there are always going to be a few more traditional gardeners, you might say, who will always insist that peat is best. But that I am finding just in my contacts, I suppose, with gardeners day to day, is getting less and less the case. Most people I speak to use peat-free these days.
It's clear that peat extraction has profound and far-reaching consequences, from carbon emissions to the destruction of habitats. The environmental case against peat is overwhelming. So replacing peat seems to be like a no-brainer.
It is, but it's not as simple as that. Replacing peat is hard, really hard. Let's take a look at one of the most pressing questions in the peat-free journey. Why is it so difficult to replace peat? For decades, peat has been the go-to ingredient in growing media. But as we've heard, the environmental cost of using peat is too high. So, why hasn't the switch to peat-free been easier?
To help us unpack this, we're hearing first from Fran Barnes, the Chief Executive of the Horticultural Trades Association, the HTA. Her role at the HTA puts her at the centre of the industry's efforts to navigate this transition, and she brings invaluable insights into the challenges of moving away from peat.
I think from our perspective, what we're focused on as well at the moment is ensuring that there's education for helping. We're running a series of workshops that help growers understand what the pros, cons, workarounds are for peat-free. It's completely different, and I think trying to get people who aren't in the industry to understand that brown stuff does not necessarily grow stuff. In my very, very layman's language, it's a science behind it, and helping people understand, not within the industry, because everybody gets it, that it's a science within the industry, but outside the industry, that it is a science. It doesn't just grow a plant because it's brown. And I think that there is that very top line view of it will be all right. It's in a bag, we just put it in and you put a plant in and it's all fine. Helping people understand that there is a science behind this, that it's a completely different medium from peat in terms of its shelf life, in terms of its water retention, in terms of its fertilizer properties. It's a completely different product.
And Simon Blackhurst again.
So you have to really understand your supply chain of your raw materials. You've got to understand their properties in terms of how they're going to change over time and how they interact with each other, to be able to make sure that endpoint product, when it goes to a consumer, is going to work. And that's the challenge from a growing media manufacturer point of view, getting the right mix of the right materials and that consistency time and time again.
Simon's point about consistency is so important. With peat, you knew what you were working with every time, but with peat-free, manufacturers are juggling multiple ingredients, all with their own quirks. Elaine Gottsier dives even deeper into the practical challenges of finding and balancing these alternative ingredients.
I think from a technical point of view and from the trials that we do, we know that we can produce all kinds of really good peat-free mixes, but it's which of those mixes actually still perform in the hands of our consumers.
Right.
And we can actually manufacture at scale. We can put them into a bag. They're going to be storage stable. They're going to give reliable results. There's 101 materials that you could use to replace peat, but there are only a very few which meet that requirement to actually work in the hands of our consumers reliably.
Evergreen Garden Care, who Elaine works for, is a global company. And so we wanted to know how other countries manage. We know they're not all using peat in their growing media. In fact, Australia has never used peat as they don't have any peatlands available. Let's hear Elaine again as she discusses how geography impacts the availability of raw materials.
Yeah, it is a good question. And we've learnt a lot from our colleagues in Australia in terms of how they produce their peat-free growing media and the materials that they use. But even between ourselves and our colleagues in France, there are geographical differences in the available substrates. So you can imagine how many times that's multiplied if you think about going from here to Australia. So in terms of the materials they use, they have access to a lot of pine bark, which we don't have access to here. They're using biochar, which is produced from macadamia nuts, not particularly available in the UK. Macadamia nut shells, obviously no waste. Yeah, and we see that in each of the geographies that we operate in, that it's a question of finding something that's available locally. You know, the economy around the production of growing media doesn't lend itself to shipping materials long distances. It's bulky material and relatively low value versus the cost of transport. So we're all looking for local raw materials. But having said that, we're applying the same sort of principles in terms of what we're looking for and what we can use. So it's more on the sort of fertilizer side and additives that go with those substrates that we can learn from Australia and New Zealand.
So not only do we need to find alternatives, but they also have to work within the context of what's available locally. And even when we do find new materials, there's still the issue of tweaking formulations to ensure they work well.
So we work together very closely with our supply chain colleagues. So a big part of the initial assessment of a material is to look at where it is, how practical it would be to supply it into our factories, what volume of it is available, and then from that, is it worth us investing in researching into it and making it possible to use? So if it's practical, or if it's something which is a really new and has the potential to scale up, is that something that we want to invest in and invest in the development of as a substrate itself? Increasingly, because rather than just having peat and saying, okay, can I put 10% of this into a peat base and does it have a positive or negative effect? We don't have that peat base to sort of work from anymore. So it's more doing some physical and chemical analysis before we do any growing and comparing that with other materials that we're already using. So if, for example, this is a very, the new material is very light, it's very low density, it has low nutrient content, it holds lots of air but not very much water, then shall we substitute that for some wood fibre? If it's got lots of nutrients in it, it's very dense, can we substitute that for some green compost? And it's looking at what it would replace in an existing mix and how, whether that then has a positive, negative or neutral effect when it comes to growing plants. So there are new things becoming available sort of over time. So things like digestate fibres weren't available in the way that they are now, sort of 5 years ago. So as those materials become available at scale, then is there a role for those? If we put a small proportion of them into a mix, what do we take out? And it's all of those kinds of sort of tweaks and changes that we're looking at now to maintain. All of our formulations are assessed under the responsible sourcing scheme. So that means any new ingredient that goes into those formulations has to be audited. So we need to be thinking about the energy used in producing it, which includes the distance it's being transported into the factories, how much water is used, how renewable is it, is there waste generated through its processing, is it produced responsibly from a corporate social responsibility point of view? All of those things go into the score. So we wouldn't want to add anything into the mix that then reduced the overall score for our product.
I think this really highlights just how multifaceted the challenge of replacing peat really is. It's not just one problem, it's a whole web of interconnected issues. From the science of peat itself to the practicalities of sourcing and blending alternatives, this transition is anything but simple. But as we've heard, it's a challenge the industry is tackling head-on, with innovation and collaboration leading the way.
And that's what we'll be exploring next. What research and development goes into creating a successful peat-free growing media. So, what are the key ingredients in peat-free compost? Transitioning away from peat means identifying sustainable and effective alternatives that meet the needs of both professional growers and home gardeners.
To help us understand the role of these ingredients and how they'll be used, we'll be hearing from various people grounded in their extensive experience in the horticultural sector. Let's start with Jane Lawler. Jane is a marketing business consultant with decades of experience in the gardening industry. She's the former chair of GEMA and currently serves on the HTA Board of Directors. Jane's career has spanned roles in product development, marketing strategy, and consumer insight, making her a leading voice in understanding what it takes to develop successful peat-free products.
What comes in a bag now labelled peat-free is not like a replacement for peat-based multi-purpose, because they're all different. They all behave differently. They're biologically quite active, whereas peat was kind of pretty inert and just used to sit there. You could leave it in the bag for 2 years and it'd still be the same. You leave a peat-free bag for 2 years and you open the bag, you've got something completely different, chemically speaking. So there's a big re-education job to do. And I wonder whether we have to try and get away from the multi-purpose mantra now and go back to, buy this if you're sowing seeds and you're raising very young plants, buy this if you want to fill the containers on your patio for flowering plants, buy this if you want to grow leafy green vegetables. I think we probably can't just jump straight into multi-purpose peat-free. I think we've possibly got to go back and be a little bit more selective about what we sell people.
And here's Sally Nex again.
At the Peat-Free Partnership, we are very, very supportive of a circular economy. So what we're talking about is that composting and making compost, making growing media can actually really feed into the benefits of having a circular economy that relies on recycling. Because, of course, most of the ingredients that go into a peat-free compost are recycled ingredients. So we're talking about waste wood, waste bark, all of those kinds of things. So they are very much things which would otherwise be thrown away. Green waste, of course, where it's used, that's more problematic because of the various issues with things like contamination. But digestate, there's lots of things which are byproducts of existing materials, existing organic material use, which can also be used in compost.
So let's look in more detail about what goes into choosing the best ingredients that will be blended together to create a peat-free mix. Here's Elaine Gotts again from the Levington Research Station. We asked her what would be the ideal peat-free ingredient.
There's definitely a benefit in the mixes that we have now being a combination of different materials versus reliance on a single material, which is where we were, where we come from with peat. But But in terms of the ideal characteristics, I think something which is easy to manage, so something which is easy to water. I mean, if you're talking magical ingredients, something that indicates to you when you need to water would be ideal. That was, I know when we've done, crazy sort of innovation sessions, we always come up with a color changing compost. That is, that's what you need. That, something that, plays a tune when it needs to be fed. That sort of.
That would be great.
But, anything that's easy to manage, nice to handle, holds on to nutrients as well. So something which has to, not to be too technical, but something which has good cation exchange capacity. So it holds on to the nutrients. It will buffer them. So you can put lots of fertilizer in. It's not going to burn the plant, but it'll be there to release slowly and nurture it over time. So it makes a product foolproof for the consumer. And that's what it's all about, really, is making something which in the hands of the consumer will get their plants to thrive and will make them feel successful.
So that's the ideal ingredient. But what about the ingredients that are currently being used?
I suppose something which has surprised us in a good way, has been the way we've been able to increase the proportions of wood fibre in our mixes. Okay. For something that we originally started to look for a source of wood fibre as a partner for green compost. Because when you think about something which is locally produced, which is available in large volumes, green compost is there. It's in the UK, and it's something that we wanted to find a way to be able to use. So to be able to even out the negatives that could come from it, and wood fibre is a great material for doing that. So we really looked at investing in a process to make wood fibre on a commercial scale, to be able, as a means to be able to use green compost. And yet doing that, I don't think we'd really appreciated the benefits of wood fibre itself, but the air water balance that it has as a 100% material. And again, if you were wanting to grow with lots of liquid feed, you could grow in just wood fibre. It's not suitable for our home gardeners, but you could just fill a pot with that and grow in it almost like almost a hydroponic substrate, something like that. Right. But it's got great structure, and the process that we use is making a biologically stable fibre as well, because we're infusing it with nitrogen. So that's something which I think we've been able to build on and to use a lot more widely than we perhaps thought we would, to the extent that we bought a second machine to double our production. So I think that's something which has gone a lot better than we at the beginning imagined it might have done.
Start with the biggest benefit of coir. Coir is the only substrate that could completely replace peat and be used 100%.
That's Steve Harper again.
So every other ingredient, wood fibre, bark, digestate, green compost, whatever, you can only use percentages of it in a mix because of its chemical and physical attributes. Coir, you can grow 100%. You can add it with fertiliser and grow 100%. So it works really well.
Next, we'll hear from Dan Durston, the National Sales Director of Durstons, a family business in Somerset with a 150-year history. Durstons has embraced the challenge of transitioning from a peat producer to a peat-free company, investing heavily in R&D and developing innovative products to create a successful range of peat-free growing media. Here he is discussing some of the ingredients that they've been developing and are using in their final mixes.
We've developed a product called Grow Boost, and it's a product that we produce ourselves. We rent an airfield to be able to do that.
Right.
We bring in past 100 green compost, and we blend with it other materials, and we store it in windrows. And then turn those windrows every week for 10 weeks, which composts the material, heats it up to over 60 degrees, and then we double screen the material so that we're taking any oversized materials, which was very strange to a concept to sort of get my head around, because we were buying screened materials, but
you still got to screen it.
You would be amazed on some of the things that we screen out, or some of the sizes of things that we screen out. But yeah, we've perfected that product now, and we're very, very happy with it. And that makes up one of our ingredients of our new peat-free mixes. And the newest one, which is very different to us, is a what we call grow fiber. That's needed quite a lot of investment in machinery to be able to put together. So we use coir. We blend the coir with shredded wood fiber that we bring in bales, and it's unique to us in the UK at the moment. And its uniqueness is that it comes from one species of tree.
Right. Okay.
We know its properties. There's not a blend of different woods that react differently, so we know its properties. So when the wood fiber is shredded and reopened from being compressed in a bale, it's got short fibers, and we need to blend the coir in amongst those short fibers to keep it open. Otherwise, it would flatten itself again. Right. So we're very, very pleased with that product, and it's light in density and light in color as well. So it helps fill a bag, and we know its nutrient value.
As has already been mentioned, digestate is attracting a lot of attention as a key ingredient in peat-free formulations. That brings us to Toby Thomas, Managing Director of Rocket Grow. Toby's company specializes in using digestate, a byproduct of anaerobic digestion, to create high-quality, Soil Association approved organic growing media. Rocket Grow has become a leader in blending digestate with other substrates, pushing the boundaries of peat-free innovation.
It is relatively new. There are a couple of smaller players out there who've had products out in the market for a few years, but we're the first company to have a full range involving multiple different compost products that rely on digestate as the sort of the core ingredient. That's one of our many differentiators. It's a lively ingredient. It's an exciting ingredient. What it adds to the soil and what it adds to plant health is fantastic, and it's totally natural. But you're dealing with something that you need to tame as well. You need to learn. You need to nurture. You need to respect. And when you're putting something like a digestate fiber onto soil in a field, it's slightly different, of course, to putting it into a pot on a terrace or in a window box. And so we had to make a bit of a transition there when it came to our thinking and our understanding and our learning. But that was all part of the excitement of what we were doing. Yes, it was eye-opening and an adventure. But when you're dealing with something that is absolutely fabulous, is a really wonderful substrate, only positive things to come out of that.
And here's Will Scott from Heart of Eden also talking about digestate.
Final ingredient which we have settled upon is a fuel crop digestate, where they've taken fuel crops and then harvested them. They extract the biogas from them and the liquid material that they can out of that, and the solid vegetable matter that's left behind is still very rich in macronutrients. We are able to take that as what is regarded otherwise as a waste product and use it ourselves as part of our compost.
We have one product called Magic Mulch, which is 100% pure digestate fiber, and we believe it's the ultimate mulch for any gardener to use. It's clean, it's chemical free, it's pure crops, and the worms love it. The soil loves it. The plants love it. So that's where all this came from. Because what Tim doesn't know about soil health and growing things isn't worth knowing, frankly. And so we've sort of lent on his knowledge, his experience in farming, and then built from that first product a range of 24 different products. And we blend that digestate fiber in varying levels, but we only put about 10 to 20% digestate fiber in the compost, and some of them even less. So along the last 3 years, we've learned so much with our agronomists and horticulturists as to how to blend substrates such as wood chip fines, bark chip fines, bracken into the digestate mix to create the product range. And it's been we've learned a lot with a lot of help from a lot of professional people like horticulturalists and laboratories and trialing, and we're very happy with where we've got to today. So it's a wonderful virtuous cycle where you feed the soil, you harvest the crops, you make the gas, the byproduct goes back on the land to grow the next crops. It's a brilliant story, and the fact that the digestate fiber delivers all that is testament to how good it is as a substrate. And I guess in some ways it's surprising that it hasn't really been involved in growing media until up to maybe a few years ago.
Right.
But I think that's probably down to the fact that peat was so dominant, and so the industry didn't have to think out of the box. It didn't have to look at alternatives. And since that debate's sort of come to a head, although it's been running for 20 years, it has come to a head. I think the substrates such as digestates are coming to the fore and being used more widely, and of course that's what we're all about. It's not an addition; it's a core part of our DNA.
Toby highlights the promise and complexity of digestate. Its role in soil health is transformative, but it's clear that getting the mix just right takes time and expertise. We've barely scratched the surface of the number of ingredients that are currently being used in peat-free formulations, let alone all the new materials that are currently being trialled in R&D facilities up and down the country. So that's why we're going to be exploring the critical role of responsible sourcing in the transition to peat-free growing media. As we move away from peat, it's vital to ensure that the alternatives we use are genuinely sustainable and don't create new environmental problems.
This is where the Responsible Sourcing Scheme comes on. It provides a framework for assessing the sustainability of growing media ingredients, ensuring manufacturers can make informed choices. So let's start with Steve Harper, Chair of the Responsible Sourcing Scheme, as he explains its origins and purpose.
When the government started looked more seriously in 2011 at putting a peat ban in, and then came up with the environmental white paper that kind of said that by 2022, I think it was, 2020 we were going to be out of peat, and then by 2030 the growers would be out of peat. One of the questions I asked and others asked was, how do we know what we're moving to is more responsible, more sustainable than peat? Because it was a case of ban peat, but nobody thought about what the future looked like. And a quick analogy that I kind of have repeated a number of times is, if you remember back, we were all encouraged probably 15 or more years ago to all move to diesel cars because they did more miles per gallon and produced less carbon. And then 5 or 10 years later, they realised that the particulates that diesel engines chucked out was much worse for human health and actually don't go to diesel cars. Yeah. And I didn't want this industry to do the same thing. Okay. And I guess that's where the Responsible Sourcing Scheme came along. It measures all substrates. So it doesn't matter if it's peat or coir, bark, wood, digestate, it doesn't matter what substrate it is, measures them all equally. So the idea at the end of the scoring process that the scheme brings about is you can then look at what are the most responsible substrates and make your decisions based on that. Right. As it happens, peat is the least responsible substrate. So we are definitely heading in the right direction, but that was what it was designed to do. So what the scheme's done is that it measures every substrate and it measures them against 7 different criteria. So it looks at the amount of energy that's being used, the amount of water that's being used to process it, whether it creates any pollution, habitat and biodiversity, whether there's any damage to that, resource use efficiency, is it creating a lot of waste at the end of the process, social compliance, because not only are we talking about products from the UK, but we're bringing products in from overseas. And then the renewability of the materials.
This focus on the measurable impact is vital, especially as consumers become more environmentally conscious. And speaking of consumers, Jane Hartley from Evergreen Garden Care explains how the scheme is there to help people make an informed choice.
The responsible sourcing scheme is very similar to the energy rating that you have when you buy a washing machine or a fridge and a freezer, etc. And we've got this A to E star rating, and if you've got a very responsibly sourced mix of ingredients, then you'll get an A rating. Whereas if you've got something that's got peat in, generally it's going to be a D or an E.
That's such a helpful analogy. The idea of an A to E rating system makes it easy for consumers to understand the impact of their choices. And we asked Steve Harper about the uptake of the scheme. After all, there's no point in having a great scheme like this if no one is using it.
Of all of the ground media that's produced in the UK, probably the manufacturers that account for 90% of that production are within the scheme. And it's being rolled out now to retailers and growers as they join, because they want to understand how responsible they're being.
That's an incredible level of industry participation. It shows just how seriously manufacturers are taking the need for responsible sourcing. It's looking like the scheme is a game changer for the industry, ensuring that the transition to peat-free doesn't come at the cost of sustainability.
As we've heard, responsible sourcing is about much more than replacing peat. It's about building a future where every ingredient in growing media is chosen with care for the planet and its people. Coming up next, we'll explore one of the most controversial topics in peat-free media, the use of coir and the debates surrounding its sustainability. We're going to lift the lid on the coir conundrum and hear from our experts on how to navigate this challenging topic.
We want to take a balanced view on this tricky subject. There are certainly strong arguments being made in the industry. We're going to hear from Sally Nex, a journalist and peat ban campaigner. But first, here's Toby Thomas from Rocket Grow with his thoughts on coir.
We're questioning coir at the moment as being a substitution for peat that makes sense or not. We don't have any coir in our products, and we never will. And I think that's really down to the fact that the carbon footprint of shipping coir from Sri Lanka or India to the UK is unacceptable. The working conditions of the workers in Sri Lanka and India who process the coir is not good. The amount of water that's used, the process of creating that coir pith and getting it to the UK is not great for local water tables and can lead to damage to local environments there as well. So we're not very happy about coir as a substrate, so we'll never use it. But we've got to put something in the bag. So it's very difficult for the industry to adjust taking peat out. But there are alternatives that, as we're demonstrating, that don't involve regrettable substitutions.
It's so important, this. There are many ingredients, like, for example, coir, which also has it may not be peat, but it also has a very high carbon footprint. The other problem with coir too is that in order to be able to process it, you have to, I understand, wash it with lots of fresh water in an area of the world, i.e. South Asia, where fresh water is quite at a premium for people. So, I don't really want people to be using their fresh water to be making plant pots for me. I'd much rather that they, or indeed compost ingredients for me, I'd much rather that they used it, for themselves.
So it's clear that coir is being put under the microscope and its sustainable credentials are being questioned. However, coir is playing a vital role in many peat-free formulations that are currently on the market due to the unique properties it possesses, as we've already heard. Here's Will Scott from Heart of Eden again.
We have what we call a virgin coir. So that's coir that comes straight off the coconut plant. It's been broken down, divided into fine particles. Now, of course, the coir that we have to get from India, that's not exactly the most sustainable option, but it's a multi-million-dollar industry for that country. So they are looking to export it. And we find it's something which we need in our blend, but it's something we can use very effectively.
Probably the person who knows the most about coir that's used for growing media production in the UK is Steve Harper. We've heard from Steve already with his responsible sourcing scheme hat on, but Steve is also the managing director of Southern Trident, a peat-free growing media company, but also an importer of coir. We asked Steve about his experience of coir production and what he would say to some of the detractors out there.
There's genuine concerns from some people, but that's, I think, because they don't understand the product. Yeah. And then there are, and I mentioned competitors in the marketplace. Competitors have got invested in other products. You've talked to some on your podcast in the past, and they're trying to push the benefits of their product. And one of the ways of doing that is trying to say it's better than this or that because of. And I think it's actually damaging for the industry because gardeners will get the wrong impression. And I think if we're going to make green claims, we have to make fair and reasonable green claims.
As a business, again, we belong to an organisation called SEDEX, which basically looks at corporate social responsibility and the working conditions of the people that work on the various sites. So for us, it's a critical thing. I've now visited numerous factories that we operate from and also other factories that we don't operate from, just so that I can get a bigger picture as I can.
Okay.
And the working conditions that I've seen have all been really good. Okay. I've not seen any issues there. The relationships between, if you like, the management that I've been walking around the sites with and the staff all appears to be really good. The working conditions of the staff is very different to the UK, don't get me wrong, but they don't appear to be poor conditions in any way, shape or form.
And they're earning money.
And it's a massive earner for the population, particularly of South India.
Right.
If the coconut industry was taken away, the poverty that would come from that would be enormous.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's something that isn't addressed, is it, at all?
So that answers some of the questions over working conditions during production. But what about the questions over the amount of water required during production?
Do you know, this is kind of proved to be the biggest misnomer.
Right.
And what I can't understand is how this hasn't been explained previously. Why, when I've gone out there and I've spoken to the factories and got to have an understanding of this, you wonder, why has this not come to light before? Because it's quite simple. So there's kind of two areas. So for 6 months of the year, it's monsoon season in India, and you don't need to use any potable water. Trust me, there's more than enough coming out of the skies to wash the material. So that's fairly straightforward.
Right.
The water across Tamil Nadu, which is the main coconut producing region in India, is controlled by the government. It's not controlled private companies as we've got in the UK, government entity. Okay. And they broadly break water usage down into three areas: human consumption, agriculture, and then the coconut industry.
Oh, right.
So they've got it. And what they treat the coconut industry, the water there is what they call commercial water.
Right.
It's all the same water, but they put that as commercial. Basically, they keep an eye on all of the water levels across the Tamil Nadu region. And whilst there is copious amounts of water, plenty of water, the coconut industry has access to water. Right. The moment water becomes constricted, the coconut industry gets switched off.
Right.
And they are not allowed then to take more water. So they can't create the problem. Right. If water becomes even more constrained, then agriculture is switched off. So there's always water left, if you like, for the human population. So the water isn't an issue. And in fact, I think even in the responsible sourcing scheme, we have to look now, we understand that, how we measure that more differently. Then one of the other issues that's raised is what happens to all that wastewater. Yes. And that's been thrown up as a big issue. Again, talking to our main factory over there, all the water that's gone through is washed the coconut. We use that water to water the coconut plantations. Right. So it gets pumped into the coconut plantations.
Recycled.
And it's absolutely recycled. And some people sit there and go, well, doesn't that drive salt levels up?
Yeah, because that water would be my thought.
But they've been doing it for decades. Right. And there's absolutely no ill effect. And I haven't dug into that specifically, but my assumption would be is because 6 months of the year there's so much rain coming down, that if the salt levels do increase slowly during the spring and summer, it all gets washed back away again when we get through to the autumn and the winter when the monsoon seasons are around.
And possibly the biggest criticism that Koya receives is around the distance Koya must travel to get to the UK. Let's hear what Steve had to say about that.
One example that is quite simple. People kind of make this point, it's coming from halfway around the world, which is a fair comment.
Absolutely, yeah.
If you look at the carbon footprint of a cubic metre of Koya,
right,
shipped from the port in India, Tuticorin, across to Liverpool, let's take as an example, versus a cubic metre of bark, composted bark being brought down from Scotland to Liverpool by truck.
Yeah.
So within a container, because the Koya is compressed, you get about 350 cubic metres in a container. On that container ship, there's anywhere between kind of 9 and 14,000 containers. So actually, if you look at that versus that lorry bringing bark down from Liverpool or down from Scotland to Liverpool, there's only 60, 65 cubic metres on that lorry, and lorries are really inefficient from a carbon perspective.
Yeah.
Actually, the carbon footprint of those two journeys, Koya is about 40% less than bark for those two elements of the journey.
Yeah. I think it's fair to say that despite appearances, Koya may not be perfect, but it doesn't appear to be the evil ingredient that it's made out to be. It's interesting because we don't hear the same strength of arguments over the environmental credentials of, say, coconut milk in the food industry. I love a Thai curry, but I don't think twice about buying coconut milk from the supermarket.
I think you're right, Kate. And the other thing to bear in mind is that thanks to the responsible sourcing scheme, we can measure the environmental impact of all the ingredients, including Koya. So it's clear how it stacks up.
And the last topic we're going to be looking at in this episode of the podcast is the path forward and how we can restore much of the damage that's been caused by decades of peat extraction. Here's Jane Hartley again from Evergreen Garden Care.
Last year, we purchased a grow media plant up in Kirby, Merseyside. And when I first heard about it, it was just a grow media factory. I didn't really think much more about it. It was just another factory where we could produce all of our grow media. But actually, when I visited and heard more about the story about that particular site and what we're helping do in that area, it's such a lovely story. So the Kirby site has a manufacturing site, and I know. Phil, you've been there, but it's on an old peat bog that is currently being restored. So we're working in partnership with the company that is that owns the land and helping bringing that land back and restoring it so that it will eventually become a nature reserve. And there are some areas of that area that are just beautiful. They've got biodiversity. They've got ducks and geese and all sort coming into there because they've done so much work to make it a beautiful area. So it's a really lovely story in terms of the fact that you're making a real difference to the site, that we're helping restore, peatland that we previously excavated. And we're creating a nature reserve for the local community. I mean, that is just a wonderful story in itself, and I just love the fact that we can do that. There are companies that have to offset their carbon emissions and by planting trees, but actually we're on our actual site. We're making such a difference.
And this is obviously a peat-free factory.
Yes, it's completely peat-free manufacturing site. So it really fits with the messages that we're setting in terms of, we're out of peat. We are doing everything that we want to do to restore that balance. Okay, it's going to take us 1,000 years to get back to what we had before, but you can already see in just a few months or, over a year, a real difference to the site.
When we had our discussion with Dan Durston, it became clear that the peatland his company is based on was actually drained centuries ago by the monks of Glastonbury to create land that could be farmed, either for crops or grazing. He told us about the restoration efforts Durstons make to the peatlands.
We've always harvested our peat in a sympathetic way, and we've always restored the bogs thereafter to produce wetlands and fishing lakes and haven for nature. Because, when we started excavating, they were just very low-level grazing land, and what we left behind is a habitat for nature and wildlife everywhere.
And here's Jane Hartley again.
We donated all of this peatland that had been excavated for peat around our Hatfield Grow Media site. And it's now become a beautiful nature reservoir in Yorkshire, another one down in Somerset. And we've got we're doing similar things in Lancashire and also around Merseyside. So there are really lovely stories, and I just had no idea what we were doing. And for someone that had been in the business for as long as it was, it almost felt as though it was a dirty secret. But actually, we're all businesses. We all have done things that perhaps we shouldn't have necessarily done in the past, but it's about talking about all of the great things that you've done as a result of that. And I think that's really important for any business is, we're a chemical business. You can't hide behind what your history is, but it's about changing that history and showing that as a business, you are really so committed to sustainability. And it really is at the heart of everything you do going forward.
As we've explored today, peat has been at the heart of the garden sector for decades. Its unique properties, from nutrient retention to water management, made it almost perfect for growing medium. But, as we've heard from our contributors, the environmental cost of peat extraction is too great to ignore.
The transition to peat-free isn't without its challenges, and we've uncovered why it's difficult to replace peat, the complexities of alternative ingredients, and the vital role of responsible sourcing in ensuring that the solutions we move to are genuinely sustainable.
It's a journey that's requiring innovation, collaboration, and a real shift in mindset, not just for the industry, but for home gardeners too.
In the next episode, we'll dive into the practicalities of making peat-free work. What does this transition mean for professional growers, garden centres, and gardeners themselves? What are the biggest challenges still ahead? And where are the opportunities for innovation and growth?
We'll also explore success stories and the creative solutions emerging in peat-free compost development. It's about turning challenges into opportunities for a more sustainable future.
So, join us for episode 2, where we'll take you behind the scenes of the peat-free revolution and highlight the practical steps we can all take to support this vital transition.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Underground Podcast.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, could I ask a small favour? Please take the time to review the show and share us with your colleagues. It really does make a difference and will help others to find us too. To keep up to date with the latest happening from the Underground, sign up to our email newsletter at theunderground.fm. I'm Kate Turner, the Gardener Guru. I'm a horticulturist, garden consultant and presenter. To find out more, check out my website at gardenerguru.co.uk.
And I'm Phil Wright, the founding partner of Wright O'Bara, a creative marketing agency specialising in the home and garden sectors. And for anyone bringing a new product to market, we've created a handy 7-step guide to help take your product marketing from zero to hero. Find out more at wrightobara.com.